I want to first of all take you all today to, 1919 and 1920. Our boy A.J.P. Taylor was just a little boy then. So it's not we're looking for Taylor's birth, but what we are concerned with is the fact of the question of the origins of war. But I can tell you that by 1919, they were already starting about the origins of World War I. People went nuts in Germany, Britain, USA, and last but not least, France. All, of course, having a variety of points of view and perspectives, because, of course, that makes the field of history so interesting, right? That people have these different points of view. To some extent, Germans wanted to prove that it wasn't their fault, that everyone had a role in it. The French, of course, just the opposite, that they were simply trying to maintain themselves, and the Germans had been responsible. The British and the Americans, on the other hand, as they would continue to do through the 20s and so forth, would try to, I don't know, waver. You know, their points of view and perspectives would change, but they would never be with the ferocity of the French. That is to say, anti-German. All of this is to say that the various points of view about the origins of World War I almost goes on now. I know you would think after all this time that all this would be settled and done, but you think about Franz Ferdinand and the assassination and the Black Hand and who was really responsible. Did the Serbians know what the Bosnians were up to? And all the rest are questions that I guess we'll never really know. In any event, the question that we are dealing with today, the origins of World War II, has a somewhat different stage because some of us remember 1961. And you think we don't remember 1945, but regardless of our age, we're aware that that is, according to my mathematics, 16 years. So that's very different than World War I, isn't it? To think this book, the book that was such a sensation when it came out, and I mean sensation in the sense of controversy, obviously, and in some ways still remains it. I expect that before he died in 1990, Taylor was somewhat dismayed after all of his other works that this will be probably what he is remembered for. Although he had lots of, what would you say, greatest hits in terms of German history, and his last work was a history of 20th century Britain, that volume of the Oxford history, of which he was so very proud. In any event, all of that is something to bear in mind as we start this, because by 1961, gosh, if you were young at that time, 1945 seemed like a long time before, you know? And to think about stirring up this kind of controversy. And that means that he had something new to say. Not everyone agreed with him, or not even now, but he was the kind of person who found that rather amusing. He didn't object to being, shall we say, argued against, because, of course, he thought he was right. And I'm sure he believed that regardless, as we will see. He was quite good at the art of the put down, I would call it. And we will get many opportunities to observe that. I'm not trying to do a biography of him, but I thought some detail might be nice. The Quakers I found interesting, well-to-do Quakers. In other words, I don't know if I thought that Quakers were supposed to be monastic or whatever, but I think this wasn't so much religious Quakers as you would speak of being social Quakers, in the sense of having these kinds of political and social beliefs, because I think the family was very comfortable, if you want to know the truth. And his father was an industrialist up in northern England, but they were also involved in all kinds of quote unquote causes of the left variety. So the Quaker is interesting to the extent of gaining some concept of what his orientation would have been as a young man. Now, certainly he was an atheist all his life, so that's not having anything to do with religion or believe in God or any of that. It's just that Quaker idea, I guess, of social concerns. And as we will see, that definitely affected his perspectives. Well, obviously, he was a very bright person, and he attended Oxford University, and his professors there sent him on to Vienna. And we are talking about, I would say, probably early after the Great War, that we're talking in the 20s, I would think. And he went there because obviously he was one of these wonderful people who know several languages. And so he could easily enjoy his education in German as well as English. And that is a wonderful way to be, I'm sure. So he went to Vienna and studied not World War II, World War I, but he was studying the 19th century. Well, at some extent, the 20th century had not occurred yet. But in any event, he was interested in the 19th century and the Habsburg Empire, and of course, how did Hungary become equal with Austria? And I will not go into that, but it's obviously very important to him, and there was a lot to say, and he got his, as we used to say in graduate school, got his union card, so he could be an academic himself, focusing on areas which are now not particularly sexy in academia. I know you don't think of that being sexy, but let's just say they're not fields that if you were advising someone who wanted to get a job to go into. Because if you said that to the interviewers, they would look like, really? And that's not what you want to hear when you go through an interview for a job, even at Auburn. So all of this is to say that he came back home. He taught at a place which I admire very much, University of Manchester, and many of you may have been up there. It can be a little grimy, but the university was a major center of historical studies. But it's kind of like I met this professor who teaches at Harvard, or he taught at Harvard, and he said to me, you know, I had to teach at Iowa. And I said, well, that was quite a nice honor, you know, because great school. He said, well, I just had to go there for a while before I came back to Harvard. And I thought, oh. In other words, it's like you're sent to Elba or, you know, you're exiled until you can come back to Cambridge. And I think that's what he was about Oxford. These people are up with the nose. Yeah, seriously. I think being in Iowa, I mean, it's, you know, I was beautiful, lovely, go Midwest. I mean, all of that, I get it, but not for one of those folks. I'm thinking like, now I can go home. You know, you spend about 5 years there in exile and then you can come back. You know, you belong here. You're part of us, your family, but you had to prove yourself out there with the Boondocks. Yeah. So the University of Iowa, can imagine most of us would consider ourselves very fortunate to be at a place like that. Frank pointed out that it is unusual that you find a history professor becoming a celebrity. I'm not sure now. The world has changed a lot since A.J.P. Taylor's time. I'm not sure. I've seen some of this on YouTube, and I'm thinking, I wonder if regular folks would enjoy this as much as they would have in, say, the 60s and 70s. You know, you would hope they were. Perhaps the audience is larger or smaller, but he did not talk down to people. And it's just that sort of thing about how much do you think people know? Now, I'll tell you a little Auburn story. I was challenged by a graduate student of mine. He said to me, I don't think many of our students know who Winston Churchill is. I was aghast. You're shaking your head. I know you're astounded. I know you probably would think about Clement Attlee. I don't think they know about Clement Attlee. But I told the graduate student, and they're accustomed to poverty, I said, if you can find someone who doesn't know who is Winston Churchill, I'll give you a quarter. Yeah, I mean, I go all the way. And he comes back into my office an hour later. I want $1. Yes, he had found 4 people. And he would tape it. He had a videotape of it to prove he deserved the $1. And one of these nice people, you know how polite students are, and she said, I know I should know. So that was so nice. It was like, I know this is bad. And so I wouldn't have had the heart to excoriate her, but I would have said, you need to come to class more often. Yeah, I mean, you don't know that. But it's true that the various topics that he would talk about during the Cold War, probably having to do with Russian history, indeed British history, seems to have appealed to a certain audience. And I'm not sure exactly what audience, because I think back, if any of you ever saw British television back in that day and age, it was certainly not like it is now. And it was very like ITV, or how many BBCs are there now? There are a lot of them. So it's like there wasn't a lot there. I mean, I'm not bragging. We had 3 channels. We thought we were pretty hot stuff, but they were really not very, not a lot was going on television. But such as it was, he was on various shows, and he must have had a certain following, and I'm sure that was very gratifying for an individual who spent most of his time in Oxford, England, which is, to say the least, rarefied. In terms of personal life, he did have bills to pay because he had 3 wives. Yeah, so that means there's a fair amount of alimony to be paid. And of course, children bring dental bills and so forth. So, good point. Good point. Thank you. Yeah, that's a very good point. But taxes, okay, because somebody's got to pay. Yeah. So I always think that's kind of interesting to think about. And of course, in addition to that Oxford pay, we are going to have books that people like I had to read in school, required reading, but they were, of course, written in a way that I would have to say most people would have enjoyed. He was fascinated by, as who isn't, by Bismarck and other people of that sort. But, as I've said before, he was obviously in the Austro-Hungarian period. You notice the dates of this book called The Struggle for Mastery in Europe, which is lengthy. I'd say several hundred pages. No telling how much it costs. I haven't been to Amazon to check that, but it's plenty. You see this takes it all the way to the end of the Austro-Hungarian relationship, which I want to go back to in the spring. In any event, these books are what most would say are pretty standard now. I mean, obviously, writing and research goes on, so there are other books, but they are 2 of his, I guess we'd say, greatest hits, most famous books. And I mentioned those because he does deserve that credit, even though I guess if you would ask people what's the most famous, it would be this book about World War II, which, as you can see, is after his period. Because sometimes you hear that among academics, well, that's not in my period. And like somehow now we just go to Wikipedia, right? I mean, but in the day, people would be very fastidious. I don't make any comment about that because that's not in my period. Well, obviously, if you're someone of his intellect, you don't have any problem with that particular issue because he knew plenty about the 1920s and 1930s. When he wrote a book in 1963, he made a point, which I quoted in full because I thought not only does it show his style, but it also points out his tendency, which I think is not necessarily bad, to make very, very significant statements. And this statement in 1963 basically puts Lenin and Woodrow Wilson at the focus of the new world to come. So you say, new world to come? Well, he, of course, is talking about the fact that the United States and the Soviet Union and the Cold War, and of course, most of us can remember 1963. Yeah, there were those thoughts of World War III, right? Remember that? And so the idea here was that these 2 figures emerge in 1917, and whether or not they knew it, they are now coming out in these 2 polar directions, the United States and the liberal way, and then, of course, the communist way with Lenin. And of course, as someone who himself was now a mature scholar and thinker, he was saying, he said, they repudiated the traditional standards, both preach utopia. So, I don't know if you find this a little too grandiose, but that's the kind of statements he would make. Now, obviously, that's not the totality of the book. You're just getting at these big, grand statements that we see here, and that's why I'm quoting it to you, because world history began, you have to wait till 1963 for that, but you get the idea. He's looking at this huge concept, and whether we see that now, because 1963 was quite a while back, I think we will agree with that as we appreciate the past and look forward to the future. Bismarck, he used that as a way almost to speak against his own current world. I thought that was interesting. He said Bismarck killed thousands, and speaking of Wilson here, I expect he loathed him. Yeah, I didn't mean to imply that he just thought Woodrow Wilson was such a nice guy. He didn't like any Americans, to tell you the truth. The idea is to make century just fight just wars and kill millions. So that is the idea. Was he a pacifist? I don't know. I don't think so. I think more he found wars just being inane and fought for all the wrong reasons, shall we say. But he gets this in with the Bismarck, and I thought that was interesting how he will stick in these little nuggets. And you're thinking there must be a purpose here. Now, I'm sure there was a purpose, but the purpose, of course, was to get his various perspectives in, which was of a left-leaning academic who had some strong views, very strong views. Some of you will remember the little war dealing with Egypt back about 56, 57, leading to the resignation of Sir Anthony Eden. Oh boy, well, he was in the middle of that as an anti-war activist. And so there were various times when we think of A.J.P. Taylor being active, but not necessarily in the way of a pacifist so much as he just felt that if you know about this war, it's more like you'll recall the British and French were joining with, I believe it was the Israelis against Egypt and against Nasser and so forth. But the United States, President Eisenhower refused to get involved. And so it came to, shall we say, not a good end for the Israeli side. All of this is to say that during this stage, Taylor was very involved, because we all know that it is not unusual for academics to be politically involved, and he certainly was. Now, again, he would appear to be in his 70s at this point. I'm not sure, though. Maybe it was the 1970s. I'm not sure. But if you read this clearly, if you're saying, as we go on with this, that he was somehow a Germanophile because he spent all those years in Vienna and other places and spoke German and supposed liked much of German culture and so forth. You can see here the Germans deserve what they got when they went around crying for hero. So I would hardly think this is a very nice thing to say if you're trying to win over people. And this is probably something that was said in the 1960s, I would think. And I mentioned that because of his 1961 book, because as we are going to see, that will create quite a bit of controversy in this area about Taylor himself. Here's a copy of the book. Some of you remember Low Prices. I'm thinking if you could get Cliff Notes for the good. I mean, I know you know where to go and you can get a whole collection. But it was probably like $3.95 or something. It was not bad. I don't know, but now $20 and something you could even get. When there still comes out, don't worry, hardbound, softbound, whatever. But when we think back to 1961 and JFK and all the excitement in the world and the space age, we're thinking about and what could be so big as a book like this. And it's because up until that point of view, and as far as I'm aware, certainly everybody was agreed about the origins of World War II. Now, of course, I'm sure there was somebody out there who thought something differently, but we don't know because, as you know, back then we didn't have all the media that we have today. I mean, we had some, but I just think everybody just sort of went along and said Hitler and the Nazi movement. And then let's move on to the next issue. For those in that generation who had lived through it, this was a very important book. For those of us who did not, it was important because it provided a whole new perspective on looking at it than perhaps the parents or older friends had. And I'm sure at the same time, despite his denials, that A.J.P. Taylor enjoyed every minute of it because he will say, oh, I never knew that there would be such fighting and carrying on. In other words, it's like, surely he must have known that bringing up such a topic that's almost sacrosanct. And again, we're talking about 1961, so we have to go back in our memory book and think about what would our teachers have said. I'm sure you had wonderful high school teachers, exceptional interpreters of the past. I mean, I had some World War II veterans. Did you? So, I mean, it's like we know what they're going to say. I mean, it's like there's not too much doubt. Now, you younger folks, you may have been blessed with the benefit of people with greater perspective and interested in various interpretations. I don't know. But those of us of a certain age, as they say, were presented with the point of view that basically Adolf Hitler had an agenda, and he and his Nazi supporters more or less took over Germany and then worked it out during the 30s and early 40s. And this book throws it all out. And all heck broke loose in the history world. Oh, yeah. Imagine in those faculty seminars. Yeah. And then a bunch of them come together in the lounge. Yeah. Fisticuffs. Yeah. Verbal abuse. Yeah. Our people can get rough. Yeah. That's what you have to get. I mean, it's absolutely amazing to think about the excitement that would have been engendered by a book. I mean, there are other fields. I'm not denying that, the American Civil War and whatnot. But this particular area that from 1945 to 1961 was not really argued about now becomes this major focus of controversy. I tried to get everything down to a few points, and it's that sort of thing. It's well worth reading if you're interested in the subject. But he felt, that is, Taylor felt that a lot of people who studied Hitler and the Nazis and German foreign policy confused a wish list for a list of accomplishments. In other words, a lot of us daydream. I'm going to make $1 million from Hollywood. So
It's a daydream.
I don't think it's going to happen. Is that correct? Okay. I can think about it, though. And Sherry will recommend me. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, Sherry. But you understand that's the same thing that he's saying about Hitler. Hitler had all these dreams. I mean, I've heard in lectures, even when I was a student, they would bring out Mein Kampf or something like that and say, well, he set this up. And then, of course, I would dutifully, being a little academic sycophant, I would repeat things like that. Oh, great one, here is the truth. But again, now he's denying all that. He's just saying, this is just a wish list. He's saying all of this, but that doesn't mean that these are really planned out. Those of you that have children, it's like before Christmas, they'll have the list and then they forget half of it by the time they get to Santa. So that explains that particular idea. Whether you agree with it or not is another matter. That, in other words, if it wasn't his plan, it was instead, and now he can shift the blame, that is Taylor, to British, French, and Americans. Basically, Hitler just waits for the so-called allies to mess up. And then Hitler can move in. So the idea is Hitler essentially doesn't do anything except wait for the others to mess up. He doesn't do anything deliberate. He may talk about it, but he doesn't do it. So that's one point. The second point is clearly something I think everybody would agree with. It's 1919. June, the Treaty of Versailles, and I don't know. I couldn't have done any better. I'm sure some people think they could, but you know how people will say, oh, it was terrible. They did such a bad job. Oh, books of hundreds of years, but I don't know who could have done better. Think about the big mess the world was in. You've heard me talk about this subject before, but this is what he comes down to. They didn't end World War I in a way that could prevent World War II. That's a strange way of thinking, but it's like the end of World War I, they weren't either hard enough or easy enough on the Germans. You'll have to think about that a minute. It's like you don't punish them enough to keep them down. It's so like they used to say in the old football song, they're going to rise again. They're coming back. I mean, it's like because they're put down, but they're not put down enough. And they're like that movie, they're mad as hell and not going to take it anymore. So when you bring that together with the, of course, Great Depression, then you get a sense of where he's going with 1919. So I don't think anybody would have a problem with that in terms of, you know, fighting in the history coffee room, like, yeah, come here, Taylor. You know, we're going to fight. You'll have to go to the infirmary when I finish. Yeah, no, I don't. I think Treaty of Versailles, that's a pretty surefire thing. I think we're okay with that one. Okay. Oh, the Hossback Memorandum. And I want to talk about that. Frank, I bet you know all about that.
I wouldn't know all about it. I know.
For my purpose, Colonel Hossback was an individual who made a written memorandum about a meeting of important Nazi officials, including Hitler, in 1937. And for various reasons, this memorandum ended up in, you know what, Nuremberg. Yes, evidence at the Nuremberg trials. So Hossback, a colonel, German colonel, nobody would have any idea of anybody named Hossback. But because of this memorandum, this becomes a major document. And some of you watch these true crime things, these trials and all of that. Well, you know how this evidence. And boy, when they had this, those prosecutors went to town. And again, if you had a World War II veteran teacher in school, then you know what I mean. It's like they were ready. The Hossback Memorandum talks about things like taking over Austria or moving into the Sudetenland and so forth. Now, you come along with A.J.P. Taylor, and what do you get? Well, he's poo-poos there. I know. I imagine some of those big shots at the Nuremberg Royal Trials were still alive, and they were mad as H-E-double-L when they were reading this and thinking, how dare him? Because from their point of view, this was a to-do list. You know, like we've got this planned out. We're going to move in this area. We're moving in this area. It's 1937. And you think, boy, and 38. Remember, we did a big 1938, 39. So, I mean, there's a lot going on. And what they had said at the Nuremberg War Trials was that this was basically everybody sitting around, Goering and all those folks, some of Hitler's head of the army and all these people, and basically saying, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. And Taylor comes along and said, no, they were just talking, speculating. Maybe this will happen and maybe not. Or I should say Taylor's rationale will be that they talked about it in a certain way, the Anschluss, taking of Austria by Germany. And it didn't occur the way the Hoffbeck Memorandum said it would. So it's like, as I say, if Frank and I were having a conversation that you overheard and wrote down, that we were going to take over Ollie, have a clue. You didn't hear that, Sharon. Okay. Because that's strictly private information. But if we did that, we're just talking about it. We just talking. You can't prove it. Okay, because Sherry just pledged her silence. All of this then is to say that the Hoffbeck Memorandum, he spends a lot of time trying to tear it down as being true. And this will drive these people crazy. Believe you me. Again, remember, this is 1961. And the idea, Nuremberg War Trials, and how important it was in terms of evidence. Now, many of us would not have a problem bringing up 1936. As a matter of fact, I believe some of you saw that YouTube seeing crowds there cheering the troops coming in on March the 7th. Well, Taylor basically makes that a put up or shut up moment. He says from there we go from post-World War I to pre-World War II. And that's kind of the way that I studied in college or graduate school, that it's that important. March 6th, the idea of the 1936, that if Britain and France had stood up and said, no, you can't do that. But instead, they said, well, we wish you hadn't done that. And it's not helping our relationship. But if you want to think, what does Taylor do with it? Well, he basically thinks Hitler was sort of trying. And again, you think about a child. Do you remember that scene in Kramer versus Kramer when the child eats the ice cream? I'll never forget that, because that sort of daring goes step by step. And I believe it's Dustin Hoffman is the father. And you know that scene? That's sort of, in a way, like Hitler in the Rhineland. That this would have been the chance to have pushed him back, because Hitler didn't really know what he was doing. Sort of like people go to that place in Biloxi. I think they gamble bet. If I had an advance on my Ollie salary, I could go, but I can't go now. I'm just
we're going to sell out.
Then I'll have the money. Yeah. But the idea is that he could have been stopped there. That's the theory. He was merely gambling. Whereas in these other people say, oh, no, it was all part of the great plan. So again, you have to think about what you were told in school and how people might have viewed it back then. based on what they said at the Nuremberg war trials. And now we're getting this idea, at least from from Taylor's point of view, that they're bouncing balls and thinking, I wonder what they'll do this, or I wonder if they'll do that. I guess you'd call it speculation, sort of gambling, daring. And then if that look good, then maybe you withdraw. That is, in any event, what he thinks. Finally, to add to this point of 1936, a point that might show his true orientation about Germans, and that is that he considers Hitler as another German leader. You say, well, so what? Well, because until 1961, we all thought this is a monster who takes over, blah, blah, blah. Now we're being told, as far as foreign policy is concerned, he's merely doing what German leaders had done ever since the Treaty of Versailles, and that is try to get out of it. That he is neither better nor worse. And to say that he created a Euro war and maybe helped sell more books, that is clear because, as I say, until 1961, I don't think people thought that, at least I wouldn't have, or people that I was aware of these issues wouldn't have said, oh, yeah, it's all part of the pattern of Weimar. And of course, Stresemann, I talked about at length, I believe, in an earlier time. So, outraged, downplaying the evil of Hitler, and of course, can you imagine? Taylor was, I think, both offended and resentful that people came against him the way they did. But he was completely overwhelmed when people would accuse him of being sympathetic with Hitler and the Nazis, because he said, in effect, that Hitler took advantage of others and simply carried out what he thought he could get away with. And he said, well, you missed the whole point. Basically, if we understand, I think we do, that Hitler had been operating from the perspective of, I'll see what I can get away with. I'll see what is open to me. And I'll wait for the British and the French to mess up, which won't be a problem. Because obviously, the British don't want to have a relationship with the Soviet Union. You've heard me talk about this and how the Polish issue will be a terrific problem, and how the various great powers cannot seem to get it together. So the idea is, I'll just see what happens and then I'll react. So that's what we call revisionism. And I suppose in many ways that Taylor thought that if Britain and France could have gotten it together with the Soviet Union, as they should have, according to Taylor, then Hitler would have been, shall we say, forestalled from doing what he did. Now, again, I'm not saying I agree. I'm just saying that's what I think he said. And that's an improbability if you think about Neville Chamberlain in Great Britain at that time, that he's going to form some wonderful relationship with the Soviet. It's not that they liked Hitler or Hitlerian Germany. It's like they disliked the Soviet Union just as much. But the dream was that if they had some sort of, in diplomatic terms, détente or démarche with the Soviets, then perhaps they could have prevented Hitler from moving forward. But that's just that point of view. It's not necessarily true. Now let's look after the publication with A.J.P. Taylor and an individual. I hate to use these words. You know, we like to say, well, maybe they don't like each other, or maybe they don't like to hang out. But then there are words like detest, abhor. I could go on, but I think you get my drift. And this guy came to the attention of many of us in 1983. His name was Trevor Roper, another famous Oxford professor. And if you bring up the name of Taylor, he goes into, yeah, like that. It's not pretty. Trevor Roper was a historian who thought that A.J.P. Taylor was wacko and, to be crude, and they thought of each other as enemies. And as we will see on this BBC show, I mean, there's a certain, let's have a bit of tea, perhaps a crumpet, but you know, there's not the love that we would want people to have. Okay, let's see if I can.
In 1961, Taylor published his most controversial book, The Origins of the Second World War. It caused a storm of outrage because Taylor implied that Hitler had not had any master plan for starting a major European war. Taylor proposed a new and uncomfortable picture of Hitler, not the man evilly determined to have conflict at any cost, but Hitler the opportunist, the reckless gambler who stumbled into war only at the last minute because the indecision and the weakness of the Western appeasers made it worth his while. The book combined classic Taylor ingredients, a refusal to accept even the most sacrosanct historical explanations, and inflammatory conclusions about an event still fresh in the minds of his readers. It was a bestseller. Other historians rounded on him in a fury, most famously Hugh Trevor Roper in this televised debate.
Most of us have always believed that Hitler planned the Second World War as part of a general scheme of world conquest. A whole school of professional historians substantiates this view, and a vast amount of literature has been written about these aggressive aims of Hitler and his whole philosophy of world domination and his policy. This view has now been challenged in a most provocative way in a recently published book, The Origins of the Second World War. The author of this book, Mr. A.J.P. Taylor, has said, for instance, the war of 1939, far from being premeditated, was a mistake, the result on both sides of diplomatic blunders. Can we now move on to the second half of this Czechoslovak crisis, the occupation of Prague by Hitler in March 1939? Trevor Roper, would you accept Taylor's interpretation of that?
Certainly not.
Will you explain why?
Taylor maintains that the occupation of Prague by Hitler, if I've interpreted it correctly, was an unfortunate development which Hitler himself hadn't thought of before, which was forced upon him by events in Slovakia. But he would have much preferred to have stopped at Munich. That is the implication of Taylor's book.
What is
No, my implication is that, as usual, Hitler didn't think about any of these things.
But
what Hitler said to himself, or this is how it seems to me, you can see it from his very negations, from his policy of drift in the whole autumn of 1938 up into 1939. Something else will happen.
The interpretation behind the book was all wrong, because he totally failed to take any account of the dynamism of Nazism.
I've never managed to think, for instance, of a single subject for a book. Yes, I'm wrong. I thought of one, and it brought ruin and disaster upon me. I alone thought of the origins of the Second World War, and I was abused by this for 20 years, so I've been vindicated now.
He insisted on treating Hitler as if he were, as he explicitly said, in foreign politics he was just like any other European statesman, only rather tougher. And that is simply untrue, because he was a different kind of person, and this can be demonstrated.
From my point of view, his real contribution to history was that he was the first person to put a jemmy into the received notion of how the Second World War started. And I mean, I don't mean September 1939, I mean from 1933 onwards. And Taylor actually did approach this topic with a completely open mind, and he did demonstrate to me that the blame was very widely spread and that there were all sorts of wrong turnings taken. It was never too late, almost like World War I. It was never too late to do it, to have done it differently.
I think it was one of the greatest books of the second half of the 20th century. What Origins did was to say, let's not look at Hitler as the progenitor of the Holocaust. Hitler, he says, is not a monster. He's just another German statesman. So therefore, if you look at him as a foreign policy actor, and you look at what he actually does, he's not planning this war. Therefore, what it did was to force people to look at the origins of the war, not as a moral issue, but as another piece of one might say, diplomatic history. People didn't like this. That book caused a moral firestorm around Taylor's head in a way that I'm sure he didn't anticipate, and would have been horrified, actually, had he thought this might have been the case. So it's a book that broke the logjam of history. It's a brilliant book. It forced people actually to think about what they were doing, but at the same time, it probably did appalling things for Taylor's immediate and long-term reputation.
She and the gentleman before were both Taylor students, in case you're probably not surprised that this was not exactly objective, but it does tell us a lot about their various perspectives, and I would say a certain personality difference, which would continue on. I think Trevor Roper died in the early 21st century, so he lived a lot longer than Taylor. But as far as I'm aware, they probably did not take tea together and did not hang out and talk about other issues. And part of this occurs the things that go on in faculty discussions. Who's going to get a title? This was Regius Professor. And some of you who are familiar with various, like Professor of Aeronautical Engineering, and you say, oh, well, probably that's because who can teach the most classes, or I don't think so. I think it has to do with the significance of your research and all the rest. And you think everybody else is going like a sort of miscongeniality. Oh, I'm so glad you got the title. No, because they wanted it. Why did they get it? Because it's more money. All of this is tied up with this Regius professorship. And when Trevor Roper got it and Taylor did not, Taylor is not what you call gracious. It's not like, Well, I'm just happy for you. You know, like in number 2, when you in the pageants, Miss Congeniality, and you know, I'm so glad you were so pretty. You know, just loved your dress. You know, that kind of. This was ugly, but I've come across statements from Taylor saying, you know, I really didn't care about that. Meant nothing to me at all. It's like you're not going to give them that privilege of watching you suffer. Basically, Taylor resented that for the rest of his academic career. And even his own professor, who was one of the greatest historians at Oxford, he would never be associated with him again. You bite off your nose to spite your face. Do I have that right? That expression? Close. But you get the idea. Don't know how you cut off your nose to speak. Thank you. Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, it would hurt anyway. And I'm thinking Taylor really went to extremes in this kinds of unpleasantries. So Louis Namier had been, well, he's knighted, for goodness sakes. And he wrote a really exciting multi-volume book that you can pick up called The Status of Parliament During the Reign of King George III. And I would not think, you probably want to get there and read it this weekend, okay? I mean, it can be thrilling. It's a page turner. No, and then there'll be no sleeping, no sitting in lazy boys either. You sit behind a wreck and you just read. You can have a little coffee, but that's it. But anyway, Sir Louis Namier was a very important historian, but basically, like Taylor was just like that, I guess. He was so offended. You might have noticed, by the way, his bow ties. He had quite the collection of bow ties, and he became famous for that. And as Frank pointed out, I mean, he did get to be kind of significant in terms of media of that day. And we are talking early 60s. So that's very unusual. I imagine you didn't have a lot of choice on BBC at that time if you wanted to watch cartoons or, you know, you want to. Exactly. Yeah. We're going to get to that, actually. Yeah. Because now we're in 1972. So we have come a little bit, 10 years, so in terms of television productions. And maybe the British are getting a little bit more excited in terms of what they want to watch. But in this, it's called Parkinson, and he became quite the celebrity. I don't know who I would compare him with. Merv Griffin, maybe. Somebody of that sort. I just warn you because of the haircut that you will.
Well, I would say the show is no Monty Python.
No. I don't think they're ready for that. No, there's no Monty Python. But Fanny Craddock was apparently a very important cooking connoisseur of that time, cuisine. And so to think that they would put the two of them together bespeaks, I guess, what kind of audience you would expect. You think, no, I don't want another historian. But there you are.
I think they both have large personalities.
Maybe it would be better if we became like the French.
Yeah.
Uh-oh. Go back.
Go back. Okay.
Good start.
With this big Yeah.
You could go back to it, I'll start it for you.
She'll start.
So then go back to the slide, I'll start it for you.
Thank you.
Oh, sure, start.
Maybe it would be better if we became like the French. Obviously better if we acquired some of their art of dealing with food. But they are a different sort of people.
Fanny, do you have any observations on that?
Must have been difficult to remember what it was.
You implied that we had to become like the French. Now, I'm half French, as you all know. You should become like the French. Do you always have to become like your friends?
Well, can I then, therefore, to stop you sort of leaping across at one another in the unlikely event?
No, it's very friendly.
It is. But can I put a point in here? It interested me that you made there, you see, Fanny. You were working on the assumption that politicians are different. You know, you believe that Conservatives and this government's different from the other government.
I didn't say that either, and don't you put words into my mouth. In the final account, all party politics stink.
As the historians do.
No, this is quite untrue. Politicians are not always very competent. Curiously enough, I think most of the time they're trying to do their best.
So do I.
And some of the time they succeed. But the idea that there's anything disreputable in politics, I don't think that's true. I think that I can't imagine why people devote themselves to it. It is the most ghastly and really unrewarding life they could possibly be, except for some extraordinary idea of fame, that you know, the grandeur of being minister. But why do they do it? French politicians are in politics because they get their hands in the till. Now that makes sense. But it's not true about British politicians on the whole.
On the whole, no. Yeah. But isn't it also true, and I'm speaking against myself here, that in the past, the politics of France have been appalling, deplorable, and regrettable?
No. This isn't so. They've had some very
big-minded.
No, not at all. They've had some very good governments. They've done some very enlightened things.
They changed every 5 minutes for 20 years.
It doesn't matter. It only means that they were the same chaps changing. You will find if you look at French politics, it's musical chairs that they accept that they never take the chair away. There are always enough chairs for everybody.
I know, my dear Mr. Taylor, whom I admire so much, I know exactly what it's like arguing with you. It's like holding a wet eed in a high wind, because you slither out every single time with your brilliance.
No, I think only perhaps that I'm a little more precise and careful.
Yeah, I don't think you would mess with him, but to have a discussion, shall we say, with him would be very, very difficult. But the audience is clearly ate it up, and I think as far as Fanny Craddock was concerned, she seemed to enjoy it. I don't think they took it too seriously in terms of their personal relationship, because these issues that they were dealing with at that time, you think the early 70s, definitely had moved on from the origins of World War II. They had moved on to a variety of contemporary issues of the government at that time. Those of you who remember the 70s and the early 70s. And I believe I was in London in the early 70s. And London was so polluted, I could actually see the dirt under my nails. I mean, you know, and I don't like to get dirty. And so, I mean, it was tough to walk the streets and all that. And they would have strikes. They would have strikes that would, what they call them, brownouts?
Brownouts,
yeah. I mean, it was not a good situation. Garbage.
New York.
Yeah, and basically, it was a very, very difficult time. So, watching BBC, I guess, was a way to pass the time. So, reaching larger audiences. I don't think that's going to necessarily sell books, but I guess it helps you become, I guess, a celebrity. I can't imagine, and I may be wrong, historian today being somebody that everybody says, oh gosh, I can't wait. Did you hear so-and-so's going to be on tonight? Yeah, you know, it's like it doesn't work that way. But perhaps the audiences were a bit more intellectual back then. The positions he held, supporting better understanding with the Soviet Union. Remember, we're still in those days, Cold War times. And he blamed, of course, the United States for that. I always think about how would Taylor react, A.J. Patel would react to Brexit, because he would be very much in favor of supporting all of that commonality. He went to Canada one time, and he got as close as he could to the border between Canada and the United States. And he announced publicly, he said, yes, that's as close as I want to get to the United States. So if you think he was definitely not in favor of a close Anglo-American relationship, you are very right. He found the United States, what was that old song, American Woman? Some of you may have heard of that. It was that kind of thing. We do not want to be near it. We want to oppose the United States, and we want to bring Europe together and have good relations with our Soviet friends. So that was the way he stood during his career, and he became and remains, I think, a major influencer in history, and certainly opened up new ways of thinking about how World War II came about. Far from exculpating Adolf Hitler and the Nazi movement, he merely helped, I think, his readers understand how their role could be viewed, not in any positive or good way, but simply from the perspective of the errors and misjudgments of others. Well, thank you all very much. I've enjoyed this. And please come back on the 28th of March. Am I not right? Okay, yeah. I look forward to seeing you all then. Thank you.